So I have a maybe, I mean, it's not a controversial question, but it might be. So there's been a recent slate in the past like few years of people writing about Ramakrishna, in especially from like the scholar perspective. I think it was, I forget, it was Paul Cartwright or Jeffrey Kripal, I forget which one
Kripal.
wrote the book.
Right.
Yeah. So I haven't, to be honest, I haven't had the opportunity to read them. But I do know of people, of many Hindus, and especially people within the Ramakrishna tradition, have been quite upset about how he's been presented. Now,
Right.
for you, I imagine it's like this dichotomy, because you are a practitioner, but you're also a scholar. So you come to the table with both these things running through your head. How can you talk a little bit about that particular issue and how you kind of dealt with that on both sides, if that's something you're open to?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. I think that it is a complex issue, because I actually know Jeff Kripal, so I would not attribute any malicious intent to him. He's a scholar pursuing his understanding of this material. Now, all of us, and this is how the Academy works, all of our work is susceptible to critique. And so there are scholarly critiques of his work that don't actually depend on a kind of insider-outsider dichotomy. And there are two people that actually are very close to in the Ramakrishna tradition, Swami Tyagananda and Pravajika Vrajapana, wrote their own book in response to the College Child book. It's not been, I think, as well promoted, but it's called Interpreting Ramakrishna. And it is, they've great depth about, for one thing, just the way Bengali words are read, and that if you look at a dictionary, and I'm less conversant with Bangla than I should be, but Sanskrit is something I'm much more conversant with. But if you take a Sanskrit word, let's take dharma, Well, if you look up Monier Williams Sanskrit dictionary, well, you're going to find dozens of definitions of dharma. So each of those is correct in some context or another. But someone who's really proficient with that language will tell you in a given context which of those meanings is really appropriate. And so a lot of the readings of the original source material that you found in Kripal's work, ordinary Bengalis who've been reading that same material for a century or more take exception to the way it's been interpreted. They don't read those words that way. Now, those meanings are possible interpretations, but they're not what a sort of, like a reader of the plain text would come away with. And I think the other reason, of course, that it's controversial is anything connected with sexuality is controversial. And so Kripal's reading is very charged with sexuality, and he would say, well, it's there in the original source material. And we had a really good conversation about this once in person, and I said to him, what you present is that there is this meaning, that this deep truth about sexuality in the teaching of Ramakrishna that the world has not seen, and he's particularly critical of Swami Nikhilananda's English rendering of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna as sort of watering these things down and so on. And I said, but, and like I just said, I said, there have been Bengalis reading this material for over a century, and why haven't they seen what you see? Yeah. And he says, and he said correctly, he said, it depends upon your hermeneutical lens, right? Your interpretive, you need this sort of interpretive tool in order to read it. And then here's the comment that I found very helpful and very revealing. He said, it's just like all the homoerotic imagery in the Gospels. Now, having grown up Catholic, which Kripal also did, my first thought, and I bit my tongue, I didn't say it, but my first thought was, what homoerotic imagery in the Gospels, right? And then, of course, if you look into it, you become aware that, there is a whole interpretation of the Gospels that gets into certain things that are said that can be read, with that particular interpretation in mind. And when you're hearing it read in church, that's not the hermeneutical lens. That's not the that's not the virtual reality helmet that you're wearing at that moment. You're there as a devotee, and you're hearing something else. So people in the Ramakrishna tradition have told me, and I think this is my view as well, that and I don't think this is true of everyone. I think there are people who would have just reflexively hated his book no matter what.
Right.
But there are people who've said, if he had emphasized, this is my interpretation,
Right.
this is how I am reading this with this particular set of assumptions, that there would be far less objection to
Sure.
the
Right.
and he does say that, but I think there are other places where he sounds pretty firm that he's describing a historical fact, and so then it becomes very, very contentious, right? Because you're saying it is this way, it's not this way. Whereas if we think in terms of different kinds of readings, I think we're on much safer ground.
Right.
So yeah, what it taught me as a at that time young scholar was that when we give an interpretation of something that is different from how the community understands it, we have to be super sensitive about that.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean that we have to censor ourselves, or this is, people say, well, freedom of speech and so on. Yeah, I absolutely believe in freedom of speech and freedom of scholarship. At the same time, you don't want your work to be misunderstood. And unless you really are trying to offend Hindus and you really have something against the community, why do that, right? Present it in a way that is, I understand that this is the tradition. And I think it's important to show that you understand the traditional way that texts are read before offering something novel, because a lot of Hindus might just think that you're incompetent. It's like, well, he thinks this book's about this, but we all know that it's about something else. And so it really taught me to tread carefully in terms of the kinds of interpretations. I'm also not myself all that drawn to Freudian interpretation, so it's not an issue for. I'm interested in philosophy. I'm interested in is all of this really true or not? Is what I'm more interested in. So I've never gotten into any of these kinds of issues, but a lot of scholars have, and I think it really just it underscores our responsibility to both to our scholarly vision of how we want to interpret something, but also to the community whose texts and practices we're reading. And I really understand. I mean, you can look at it from a post-colonial perspective as well. A lot of Indian Hindus, I think, are very rightly upset that, who does this white guy think he is to psychoanalyze us and talk about our family dynamics and so on? He doesn't know us. He hasn't been in our home. I know people who've critiqued Kripal's work from a psychoanalytic perspective too, that you can't really psychoanalyze someone who lived 100 years ago through
in a different culture.
In different culture. And through a text that is not in your first language. I mean, it's just, I remember there was that famous case of Terry Schiavo, who was in a vegetative state, and there was a senator with a medical degree, and he, it was, I think, a political stunt, but he diagnosed her based on a video and was just criticized by everyone. You don't diagnose your patient by video, much less through 100-year-old text in a different language.
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of comments, right? I think you're right on point and totally right about the hermeneutical lens that one's wear. I mean, one wears when you look at any tradition or any culture, community, or text, right? Like, for example, like in India, the relationship between friends, males, is very different, right? Like they walk around holding hands, and they behave in a way that I think in the West, when they look at it, be like, oh, there's some homoerotic or there's some homosexual tendencies going on. But if you're not able to understand relationships within a certain community and a culture and civilization, then these lenses that you wear give you a wrong perspective as to those relationships, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's my first thing, is sometimes the difficulty is when scholars, and everyone, not just scholars, we all come to the table with our own mindsets, our own, like, I mean, as we get into later on about reincarnation, well, our own vasanas and some scholars, all this stuff that's connected in our brains, that's already preset. We're not tabula rasa. So we come there, and we engage with whatever we do, and we bring those things to bear. And sometimes that reflects on what you're, not necessarily what you are, but the way you're approaching these situations. It was more about the fact that when you engage with communities and people, you have to, like you said, put the I guess the tagline, this is my interpretation. But a lot of times what I've also noticed is scholars and historians will take that maybe and over time make it a fact, right? Oh, it's possible this is the case, but as you read more and more of the book, they refer to that possibility as being like a true premise or a true conclusion to jump onto the other points. And my last point would be like, is there a tendency within academia or scholars, because the publish or perish paradigm, that you have to kind of produce something of controversy or some big splash for you to have any impact in the industry?
I think there's some truth to that, definitely. I mean, to the earlier point you were making about how premises and suggestions of possible interpretations over the course of a book become very solidified. I think that's also true, and I think that's a fair description of Kripal's book on Ramakrishna. In terms of the publisher perish, and you need to say something original, and controversy sells books. It attracts people, and it shows that you're a very edgy, open-minded, cutting-edge kind of scholar. You're on top of things, and people want to write things that sound exciting. They don't want to write something that sounds pedantic or overly technical, and so on. So and I think all of these pressures are there. And I also think it's just a question of how, like you said, the sanskars people bring to their work. I'm very open about the fact that I came to this discipline as a spiritual practitioner. My goal is, going back to the tradition of my birth, is a faith-seeking expansion, to quote Saint Anselm, right? It's trying to understand these things as someone who's living a particular way of life, and that's not why everyone comes to this profession. And in fact, some people come with a very strong political agenda. Sure. They may have had very negative experience with religion in the Western world, and they see problems happening in India and various other parts of the world. So they're on sort of a mission to debunk religion or to show how it's all implicated with power and with politics and so on. And I don't think that's a completely invalid perspective at all, but it becomes the central driving factor in the hermeneutic that they use. And so they might be looking at a particular text with that hermeneutic, and a practitioner may look at the same text and say, this is unrecognizable to me, right? This is just not how I read the Bhagavad Gita, right? I just don't see that. And I think all these perspectives can enrich one another. Sure. I find that I really like, especially the work of scholars of Hinduism who have a lot of, even if they're not practitioners, they have a lot of ground experience. They do a lot of anthropology. They've lived in India. They've lived amongst the people.
Ramdas Land.
Ramdas is a great. He kind of takes it to the apex, But another field where I've written a bit is on Jainism, and you have someone like John Court, who's not a practitioner, but he spent years and years in Gujarat, and he knows Gujarati and Hindi, and extremely well. Like a native speaker. And people who've immersed themselves, I think, then have the sort of sensitivity that I'm talking about, because they're not writing about sort of imaginary people living on the other side of the world. They're writing about people they know. And so you're going to, even while you're bringing your critical perspective and your particular interpretive lens to the material, you're going to do it in a way that's not going to, you can't really control how people react to your work, but it's not going to very obviously inflame, someone the way you write it. And I know, one of my teachers, and she was the advisor to Jeff Kripal, Wendy Doniger, very famous or notorious in Hindu circles. I once heard her say that she was asked at a big public forum at the American Academy of Religion, is there anything you would write or do differently in light of all the controversy that you've experienced? And she said that, particularly in her earlier work, if she'd been really conscious that practicing devout Hindus would be reading this material, she would have written in a different tone, right? She would have written in a different way. And I think I think we also write with an imaginary audience in our heads.
Absolutely.
And if that audience is only made up of one's fellow scholars or one's dissertation committee, something different comes out than if one is communicating with a religious community that one's writing about. So I think that, again, it's all about not censoring oneself, but being sensitive. And saying, when it is your perspective, saying, this is my perspective, this is why I hold this perspective, but it's not the only perspective, and I understand that it's going to be different from what the community
Sure.
has. And this another point too. I think if we look back at, I think a really good model to follow is the traditional one, where the sampradayas debate with one another, because everyone's assumptions are right out front, and it's done with an understanding that you're trying to advance truth. You're not trying to undercut anyone or anything. It's or even to sell books, but that you're doing it in the name of truth. And I think this kind of ethos can really be helpful in the academy too. It's like, well, here's, someone's from the Marxist sampradaya, someone's from the Freudian sampradaya, so they're going to write in a certain way. Yeah. And if we acknowledge that, rather than try to universalize it, I think we're in much better shape.
It's interesting you bring this up, because I think so. I guess the new term they use now is steel manning someone's argument, right? So the concept of, instead of straw manning, you steel man. So I feel like the idea of purva paksha itself is inherently about giving your opponent's argument the best way they can give it, right? Yes. And then responding to the best version of their own arguments.
Yes.
And I think that tradition shows a level of, even though the polemics between the groups were heated and fiery and crazy, but the way when you engage in a philosophical dialogue is they would engage treating their opponent as a worthy adversary, instead of, and I think bringing that to our table in the way we talk and engage with each other is a very helpful thing, especially in this cold, objective academic world that partially you live in, and I tend to read it.
Right, exactly. No, I think you're right about that. I like this idea of steel manning as opposed to straw manning, because this is how I teach critical thinking to my students. I'm going to be teaching a philosophy of religion course this fall, and I've been working on the design right now. And one thing I want the students to do, and I'm going to be very clear about, is, okay, take a position on this question, and then I want you to come up with the best possible argument you can against your own position. And then come up with the best possible reply you can to that argument. And basically replicating the purva paksha method. And I think this also comes from using this method means you have a lot of confidence in your particular perspective, right?
Absolutely.
When people are very insecure, when they don't really know why they believe what they believe, then they want to shut down conversation. Oh, I don't want to talk about that. Silence those non-believers, right? Whereas if you're really convinced that Shankara had it right, or Anuja had it right, or Ramakrishna had it right, then you can charge into battle, metaphorically speaking, fearlessly, and say, let me take on all these questions. Let me look at all these objections. And ultimately, I think you get a deepened understanding of your own perspective. It enriches your own worldview.
Yeah. Hey, Racchit, sorry, I might have cut you off a few times.
No, not at all. I think this is a very interesting discussion, and I think you both have hit upon really important points, and especially Professor Long, talking about the idea, yes, the academic freedom and freedom of expression is very important, but we have to bring a certain sensitivity to the table, because if we don't, if both sides get hard-headed, we're going to lose out on great opportunities for discussion and growth on either side. Serious people like Mukunda and myself, who are practitioners but are also want to have that a certain level of intellectual balance, want to be able to have these conversations with people who have different point of views from us. But unfortunately, the situation in recent years became such where both sides kind of double down on their point of view, and it's going to lead to a landscape where there's going to be poor scholarship or less scholarship, and I don't think any one of us want that. So I think it's very important, and I think this is one of the things that's inspired Mukunda and myself to do this whole initiative, Meru Media, is have more of these conversations with people like yourself, bring these views out there, and eventually, instead of having the scholars sort of being more and more cut off in the ivory tower, actually bringing them more in touch with reality, because if more people consume this research, it's actually going to end up leading to more funding for this type of work, honestly.
That's true.
It would be a much more vibrant community that is producing objective scholarship and at the same time enriching people's experiences of either their own tradition or allowing outsiders to understand, say, what Hindus believe about themselves. That's why I like what you said about, folks who've done on the ground work, from an anthropological perspective, that's so important to bring in, because if it's a purely textual reading, I don't know any such textual Hindu. I've met the biggest panditas ever, and their own experiences, the way they live their lives, and the tradition is very different from the texts that they might be following and might have memorized and that have been passed down for 1,000 years. So that experiential element is just very, very important.
Absolutely. No, I think you're completely right about that. And you're right about how, the current trend where we're all in our bubbles, and you see that in popular discourse too, it impoverishes everybody. When you're just talking to other people who agree with you, you're really missing out on all kinds of perspectives. And this is why Ramakrishna, I think, practiced in many different sampradayas and followed different sadhanas, because he wanted to experience the infinite in as many ways, as in many modalities as it could be. And I think with knowledge, it's the same way. If we want to expand our knowledge base, if we want to truly get a deep understanding of reality, we need to dive deep into particular thinkers and particular traditions, but we also need to be expansive and talk to people who have different perspectives. And we're way too tribalized and, I don't know, bubble-fied. I don't know what word they use for that. But, everyone's in their own bubble, and it's echo chambers, and it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, it's so one of the things I like doing is I like going to churches or mosques and kind of engaging with the spiritual practice that's there, because I think it's like Ramakrishna. I didn't obviously not doing it the depth that Ramakrishna did his sadhana with all these, is just touching upon the different ways that the infinite expresses itself through infinite connections, right? And that's really like nature. Just going out and sitting in nature's another expression, or even as tough as it is, like seeing the happiness within poverty, or seeing the struggles and helping people with their struggles. That's another way the infinite expresses themselves. And I think it's the thing that we, in this political discourse in this world today, that we've kind of become is very ossified in our corners, that we're not willing to see the expression of each other in ourselves, right? Like in America, this movement towards the radical left versus radical right, versus no one's talking with each other. They're talking at each other, and they're not understanding that we all are trying to deal with the same problems in this world. Like by fighting with each other, we're not going to solve it. I mean, we have to have a dialogue, and it's okay if we have different perspectives, just as we do in between. I think there's a saying if you ask a Hindu an opinion, you'll get something like 4 different versions of it, or something like that, right? It's that the diversity of thought and engaging with each other is more important than being right, I think.
Exactly. And we don't want to lose that. And we all draw closer to truth, I think, through this kind of process. And Swami Vivekananda, is one of my favorite teachings of his. He says, we never move from error to truth. We move from lower truth to higher truth.
Exactly.
That every perspective, even if somebody says something that I deeply disagree with, even let's say they are wrong literally in terms of what they're saying, but they're probably saying that because of a certain life experience, because of a certain kind of collection of emotions that they're having at that particular time. And we can't ignore that there is some valid human experience that's trying to express itself, maybe very, very imperfectly, through some utterance that someone has. So to listen to each other and to be very patient and to really dig to the heart of things. And I find some of the best conversations I have are when I'm talking with someone with whom I really disagree, but if I can repeat back to them, well, what I think I hear you saying is this. And if what I say is, if they say, yes, you've got it, you've understood, then for the rest of the conversation, I might say anything, and they're okay with me because they know that I get it, right? That they are being heard. And I think that's just tremendously important. I think there are a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, don't feel heard right now. And from across the political spectrum, in all religious communities, non-religious, I see that.
So let me ask you this question. So because you also teach Jainism and you're an expert in Jainism, do you think the philosophical position of Anekavada would be very, very? I mean, I think it's such an important concept. Is how can it be taught at either academic level or brought into our world today, because it's a beautiful concept.
Well, yeah, and this is something that's been a big part of my work, actually, and I've begun to think that if it's really going to be promoted, it would need to we need to develop an educational system where Anekantavada is a foundational principle, that we're going to look at the whole range of possible perspectives on truth, hold whatever perspective you wish to hold, but then you're going to have to argue for it, right? The traditional purva paksha method. But the challenge will always be to also be able to see and articulate the other truth, right? The opposite truth. And one thing about Anekantavada, and this is what I'm going to be speaking on in the Vedanta Society in New York in a couple of weeks, actually, is, well, in 1 week, I better get writing, but that the vision that Ramakrishna expresses and this ancient Jain teaching are very much in sync. Traditionally, the Vedantins and the Jains were at odds, right? They were engaged in the kind of polemic that we were talking about. But I think that a Vedantin in the Ramakrishna tradition could agree that, at least on the level of epistemology, right? Even if, Jainism has a dualistic ontology, it's different from non-dualism and so on. But at least from the point of view of epistemology, that we have to say reality is multifaceted, simply because of the existence of so many worldviews held by people that, if we're honest, we have to say, well, it's not because they have bad sanskaras or they're stupid. Very, very good, bright people disagree about the nature of reality. So something about the nature of reality is lending itself to this diversity of perspectives. So I in a lot of my own work, what I've tried to do is basically establish that as a foundational principle, that this multiplicity is something that we shouldn't see as a problem, but as sort of embedded in the very nature of the conversation. Because I think traditionally, especially in the West, but you even sometimes see this in Indic writings, there's an understanding that, well, there's one truth, and then there are all these wrong views. Right. But again, if we're moving from lower truth to higher truth, then what you have is, maybe there are relative degrees of truth, and we can differ about which view is more relatively true than the other. But that, there's something of value to be found in every single perspective.
Absolutely. Hey, Racchit, do you have anything else to add? And then we'll jump onto the reincarnation.
Absolutely. Professor Long, if you could talk about the relationship of Anekantavada with Syadavada, and then also how the sort of Jain skepticism relates to more of the Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism of Greece, that would be very interesting. Okay.
Oh, sure. So, well, the relationship between Anekantavada and Syadvada, and in fact, there's a third doctrine in there too, Nyayavada, which is, so you have Anekantavada, which, for viewers who are less versed in Sanskrit, it's the doctrine of multiple perspectives, or you could call it the doctrine of the complexity of existence, that existence lends itself to being perceived in many ways. And then you have Nyayavada, which is the ways of perceiving existence. So it's the doctrine of perspectives. Nyaya is a point of view, and each of these facets of the complex reality has a corresponding point of view to which it gives rise. Then Syadvada is the method of speech that is appropriate to an awareness of these multiple perspectives and multiple views. So Syat in Sanskrit, ordinarily it means it may be, it could be, but in Jain teaching, it actually means from a particular point of view, or in a certain sense, it is the case that X. And this has been developed into a sevenfold sort of understanding of truth, in which for any given philosophical statement, you could say that it is in one sense true, in one sense false, in one sense both true and false, and in one sense indescribable, or neither true nor false. And then you have the three possible non-redundant combinations of those four, and you get 7 different layers or levels of truth. And so the idea of Syadvada is that if we further specify the sense in which we're making a claim, from what perspective is it true, what piece of reality are we addressing with that truth, then we can speak in a more precise and more clear way, and a more true way. Whereas our tendency is to speak in very broad absolutist terms, and as a result we miss other aspects of reality that don't get covered by those terms.
So it's like fuzzy logic.
But yeah, it's trying to defuzzify things and make them clearer by making them more specific. So in the classic Jain examples, they were involved in polemic with schools of thought like Sankhya and Nyaya, which affirmed eternal substances, and schools of thought like Buddhism, which affirmed impermanence, universal impermanence. And they were always at pains to say that if you look at the totality of experience, there's something that persists and there's something that changes, and that we need to acknowledge both rather than dogmatically claiming that one of these is true and the other is an illusion or a mistake. And
Right.
and that in fact, if you dig deeply into what the philosophical traditions themselves claim, and this is my own maybe kind of somewhat quasi-Hegelian addition to Jainism, but that you even find this if you tease out the logic of certain perspectives. So, for example, when you take the Buddhist claim that all is impermanent, right? Sarva manityam, universal impermanence. Well, the truth of the claim that all is impermanent is not impermanent. It is
Right.
permanent, right? It's a description of the ultimate nature of things from a Buddhist perspective. So there is something that's not impermanent, which is the statement that all is impermanent. So, and in fact, the Buddhist version of this, of course, is Nagarjuna's dialectic, whereas the moment you try to state things in words, you're going to, it's going to be a partial perspective, and it's going to be self-annihilating, finally. So I think one thing that where Sadvara is kind of similar to Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism that way, is in pointing us beyond the realm of speech, finally to a realm of experience. The truth has to be experienced. And Racchit, you'd asked about Greek skepticism and Pyrrhonism and so forth. And I don't know enough about that material to say what I'm about to say with a lot of confidence. But based on what I have studied, my sense is that some of the ancient Greek skeptics were about a similar project. That is, it was not a sort of it wasn't the kind of well, these words have crept into our language too, so I'm trying to say, well, it's not a type of cynicism, but the cynics were themselves a Greek school of thought, but that it wasn't what we today often take it to be, where okay, there is no meaning, there's nothing we can know, so let's just sort of, I don't know, have a good time. But that these seem to have been connected with spiritual practice on some level. The ancient Greek skeptics are depicted as living a lifestyle not unlike that of Jain mendicants. Some of them didn't wear clothes. They would scandalize people because they would never take a bath, and they were living in rags. And the way they're described is the way a householder who really isn't that knowledgeable about a spiritual path might describe a sannyasi or a sadhu. It's like that, well, these people are a little bit crazy. They're living on the edge of society. But I think there was a lot more interchange between ancient India and ancient Greece than is often understood in the general public. I think scholars are pretty aware of this now. It's become a big topic of scholarship. But even pre-Alexander, I think there was some kind of exchange going on between the Hellenistic world and the Indic world.
Yeah, I think there Thomas McNeilvey.
Evely, Shape of Ancient Thought. He talks about it actually with the Persian Empire, and he's got chapters in there with the Jains and the Orphics, and so he talks about all these concordances. So that's where I was first exposed to some of these ideas, and just found it fascinating that there was this whole two-way transmission of ideas even in the pre-Alexander days.
Yes, and I think Persia was a very important part of that as well. And I think that's something else that merits even further. I mean, there are people looking at that, but I'm interested in seeing more work of that kind done, because when I teach my courses too, I also talk about Zoroastrianism, for example, and you had this massive region that's right smack between India and the Greek world. It had to have some relevance in the transmission of these concepts and in the transformation of these concepts. So. I think there was a lot going on, and of course you could also argue that some of these things are universal. That no matter which culture you're from or what ideas you've been exposed to, that if reality has a certain kind of objective structure, people are going to become aware of that, and they're going to express it in their different cultural idioms, and you'll find correspondences. Fascinating correspondences between Chinese thought and Vedanta, for example. There was an edited volume put together by Ithamar Theodore, who also contributed to my Reincarnation volume. He has this volume, Brahman and Tao, and it's great. I mean, he talks about correspondences between Taoism and Vedanta. And Victor Mayer, University of Pennsylvania, he's a really great translation of the Tao Te Ching, and has an extensive article where he talks about correspondences between Sankhya, Yoga, Vedanta, the Upanishads, and the tradition of the Tao Te Ching. So people are perceiving, I think, a lot of these things across different cultures, as well as being influenced by each other culturally.
Racchit, anything else to add?
Oh, nothing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, for this particular point, it's if the underlying idea is, in the premise of which I think we all hold, is that there's an underlying truth to all this, then of course different cultures and societies would have their own systems based on what their experience of that truth was, right? So, and the correlations happen because they exist.
Right, exactly. And then kind of going back to an earlier topic, this is one of the things that attracted me to the Ramakrishna tradition, because it's just seemed to me, instinctive from my childhood that, if reality is a certain way and people are roughly equally intelligent around the world, they're all going to perceive that reality to some extent. And so privileging one particular religion or culture as, this is the one true one, just always seemed to me to be, provincial. And everyone's going to say it's theirs, right? So,
right. No, but the thing is, obviously, since you've read the Gita so many times, where Krishna himself says, everyone that worships all these other beings, they in fact worship me, and I am the source of their. So he's not telling to stop worshiping and only worship me. He's saying everyone has their own gunas that you have to follow and worship whatever your gunas. And that's going to probably come into our reincarnation topic, because I think reincarnation is the foundation of, first of all, the Gita, the way the Gita issues its message out. But before you get to that part, because someone did write about that, I think Theodore is the one that wrote about the reincarnation and the Gita. How did your book or your edited volume on the reincarnation phenomenon and ideas come into reality? Or what was the impetus for it?
Well, there were two different panels at the American Academy of Religion, actually 2 different years. I want to get the year right, I think 2016, there was a joint meeting of Donham and the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about this topic of reincarnation. And I absolutely wanted to be there because, this has been a driving concept of my life, my scholarly work, my spiritual life, everything. And one of the things that I found interesting, this is a topic that clearly many, many scholars find fascinating, and yet hardly anyone ever talks about. That's right. The book, they're going to be, let's do a Freudian reading of this particular Hindu scholar, or something like this. So the room was packed with people, and a standing room only, and really brilliant scholars. Jonathan Edelman was there, who contributed to the volume. Chakravarti Ramprasad was there. Ankur Barua was there. Frank Clooney. Bradley Malkovsky from Notre Dame, who was also a contributor to the volume. And so I really enjoyed that. And one of the things that in the discussion that followed came about was, we need to continue this conversation. So because I've been closely involved with Donham, I proposed in the following year, which would be 2017, I proposed that we have a panel on reincarnation and continuing that conversation. And Jerry Larson was part of that. Jonathan Edelman, I believe, again, was part of that. I was there, several other scholars. And that particular panel was attended by one of the editors of a journal called Religions, which is an online journal, open access journal. And he suggested that he was so taken with the conversation, he said, you should do what we call a special issue on this topic. And if you get 10 articles or more, we will actually publish it as a volume. And so I sent a call out to RISA, several other websites, and said, I'm doing this volume. Are you interested? And I personally contacted specific people that I knew I wanted to have contribute as well. So most of them said yes, and then I got a few additional people through just this broad call that I made. And the result was we have 14 articles, and so they published it. Putting it together took the better part of 2018, And I have to admit, I'll say here right in public, most of the delays were because of me. Everyone was very prompt in getting their materials to me and responding to everything, but I was involved in a bunch of stuff, so it took forever. But my articles, my introduction and then my own article were the last pieces to be written. Well, no, and then Frank Clooney did a response, which he had been the respondent to our Donham panel as well, and he expanded upon those comments. And then, it came out in January of this year, and I'm very proud of it. It's called Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much, I mean, that describes the articles right there.
And I think it was, to be honest, like, so I finished all the articles. It was really fascinating. It was just a wealth of information I did not have from before, right? There's especially the stuff that I think who wrote here, Christopher Key Chappell's article about like the differences between Buddhist, Jain, and then Hindu versions of reincarnation. Lee Irwin's article was actually very interesting, especially the American concepts and the Western idea of reincarnation, because I touched upon a few of those things when I studied Greek philosophy and stuff like that, but the depth that he covered it over the course of 2,000 years was really interesting. And obviously
book on that too, which I recommend. He has a whole book on that topic.
And then Bradley Malkowski, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, his was really fascinating because he actually, I think part of it was, I think Clooney responded to him a little more than a few other people, just because they're both talking about the Catholic tradition. Right. And I love, all the articles are great. I mean, just especially like the one about the Punarjanmakshepa. That was really interesting. I did not know such a document existed. Basically, like it's actually, can we go through it like
sure, chapter by chapter?
Like the ones that let's go chapter by chapter and just kind of discuss the topics, because I think it's really fascinating. It was very well done the way you structured it, and I thought it was it flowed very nicely, and there's so much information. It was and all the authors did a great job of actually conveying a lot of these really interesting ideas and thoughts in a very easily readable manner. So